The Eastern Front, 1943. The air hung thick with the acrid smell of cordite and damp earth. In the ruins of a bombed-out farmstead somewhere, in the frozen expanse between Kiev and Kursk, a young Soviet private crouched behind a shattered brick wall. His name was Ivan Dmitriev, a 22-year-old farmer's son from a village near Smolensk. 3 days earlier, his unit had lost 8 men to a German sniper. 8 good soldiers, each one taken down with a single, precise shot to the head or chest. The sniper was out there, somewhere, watching, waiting. Ivan clutched his Mosin Nagant rifle, his fingers numb despite the threadbare gloves wrapped around them. The temperature had dropped to negative 15 degrees Celsius, and the wind cut through his greatcoat like a knife. But it wasn't the cold that made his hands shake. It was fear, the kind of fear that comes from knowing that at any moment, from any direction, a bullet could end your life before you even heard the shot. His sergeant, a grizzled veteran named Volkov, who had survived the brutal winter of '42, crawled over to him. The older man's face was weathered, like old leather, his eyes holding that distant look of someone who had seen too much death. "The sniper is still out there," Volkov whispered, his breath forming small clouds in the frigid air. "Command wants him taken care of. They're tired of losing men." Ivan swallowed hard. "How are we supposed to find him? He could be anywhere, in those trees, in that building, underground even." Volkov's lips curled into something that might have been a smile under different circumstances. "I have an idea. It's going to sound absurd, ridiculous even, but I've seen it work before, during the First War." What Volkov proposed that day would become one of the most ingeniously simple tactics used throughout the Second World War. A trick so elementary that officers initially dismissed it as foolish. Yet this ridiculous method would save countless lives and turn the tables on some of the most dangerous predators on the battlefield: enemy snipers. To understand why this trick was so effective, we must first understand the nature of sniper warfare during World War II. The role of the sniper had evolved dramatically since the First World War. No longer were these marksmen simply soldiers with good aim. By 1943, both the Axis and Allied powers had developed sophisticated training programs that transformed ordinary infantrymen into patient, calculating instruments of precision warfare. German snipers, in particular, had earned a fearsome reputation on the Eastern Front. The Wehrmacht had retained sniper training as a specialization between the wars, though they showed little enthusiasm for it initially. But after Soviet snipers demonstrated their devastating effectiveness during the early campaigns in Russia, the German military rapidly expanded their sniper programs. By the time of the battles around Stalingrad and Kursk, German snipers were among the most feared elements on the battlefield. These were not men who simply shot at random targets. German sniper training emphasized patience, discipline, and psychological warfare. A skilled sniper could immobilize an entire company, forcing hundreds of men to keep their heads down, disrupting supply lines, and eliminating key personnel like officers, medics, and radio operators. The psychological impact was often more devastating than the actual casualties. Soldiers lived in constant fear, knowing that any moment of carelessness could be their last. German snipers used a variety of weapons, most commonly the Karabiner 98K, with a 4 times or 6 times telescopic sight. Later in the war, semi-automatic rifles like the Gewehr 43 became available. These weapons, combined with rigorous training in fieldcraft, camouflage, and marksmanship, made German snipers extraordinarily effective. They learned to use the terrain to their advantage, to remain motionless for hours, to control their breathing and heartbeat. They studied the habits of enemy soldiers, learned to identify officers by their bearing rather than their insignia, and developed an almost supernatural ability to blend into their surroundings. Back in that frozen farmstead, Sergeant Volkov explained his plan to Ivan. "We're going to make him reveal his position," Volkov said. "We need something that looks like a target, something a sniper can't resist. "But won't someone have to expose themselves?" Ivan asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "Not someone," Volkov replied. "Something." The sergeant sent Ivan and the two other soldiers to scavenge materials from the ruins around them. They found what they needed: a German helmet, likely from a fallen soldier during the retreat months earlier, some old sacking, straw from a destroyed barn, and a broken wooden fence post. Working in the relative safety of their covered position, Volkov showed them how to construct their decoy. They stuffed the sacking with straw, creating a rough approximation of a human head and shoulders. The German helmet went on top. Using charcoal from the fire they'd kept burning the night before, they drew crude features on the sacking to make it look, from a distance, like a face. "It looks ridiculous," one of the soldiers muttered. "That's because you're seeing it from 3 feet away," Volkov replied. "A sniper 200 meters out, looking through a scope, focused on finding any sign of movement? He'll see what he wants to see. A target." The concept was simple, almost absurdly so, but it was based on a fundamental understanding of human psychology and the mechanics of sniper warfare. A sniper, by necessity, spends hours scanning the battlefield through a telescopic sight. The narrow field of view and high magnification create a kind of tunnel vision. When something resembling a target appears, even briefly, the sniper's training and instinct can override caution. The pressure to take the shot, especially for a target that appears vulnerable, can be overwhelming. Moreover, the trick exploited a basic truth about human perception. Our brains are pattern recognition machines. We see faces in clouds, in the arrangement of furniture, in random patterns. A helmet with even the crudest suggestion of facial features, seen through a scope at distance, can trigger that recognition. The mind fills in the details that aren't there. As the pale winter sun climbed higher, casting long shadows across the devastated landscape, Volkov prepared to put his plan into action. They tied a rope to the dummy, allowing them to raise and lower it from safety. The sergeant chose a spot along their defensive line where several buildings had collapsed, creating piles of rubble with gaps between them. "When we raise the dummy," Volkov instructed, "watch the tree line to the east. Watch for any sign of movement, any flash of light, any disturbance. The sniper will have to adjust his position slightly to take the shot. That's when we'll spot him." Ivan positioned himself with his rifle, his heart hammering in his chest. 2 other soldiers did the same, covering different sectors. Another man, Corporal Mikhailov, held the rope attached to the dummy. "Slowly," Volkov whispered. "Make it look natural, as if someone is cautiously looking over the wall." Mikhailov pulled the rope. The dummy rose, the helmet appearing above the rubble pile. It paused there, visible, a perfect target. For 3 heartbeats, nothing happened. Ivan's finger tightened on his trigger, his eyes scanning the distant tree line. Then, crack. The sharp report of a rifle echoed across the frozen wasteland. The dummy's helmet flew backward, a clean hole punched through the steel. But more importantly, Ivan saw it. A tiny puff of white smoke from a position in the trees about 250 meters away. The muzzle flash had been almost invisible, but the smoke from the powder gave it away. "There!" Ivan shouted. "Northeast in the cluster of pines, about 15 meters up." Volkov immediately signaled to their mortar team. Within seconds they had adjusted their aim and began dropping rounds onto the position. The first shell exploded in the trees, sending branches and frozen earth flying. The second hit closer. The third was right on target. They never confirmed whether they had eliminated the sniper, but after that exchange, the precise, deadly shots that had been picking off their men stopped. Either the sniper had been neutralized or had wisely decided to relocate to a safer position. Ivan's trick, as crude and simple as it was, had worked. This incident was far from unique. Throughout World War II, on every front where snipers operated, soldiers independently discovered and employed variations of this deceptive technique. On the Western Front, British and American soldiers found themselves facing the same deadly challenge. German snipers, often positioned in the rubble of destroyed towns or hidden in the dense bocage hedgerows of Normandy, inflicted a steady toll on Allied forces. After the Normandy landings in June of 1944, Allied troops quickly learned that the Germans had not abandoned their defensive positions. Infantry advances were often stalled not by massive counterattacks, but by a handful of well-positioned snipers who could pin down entire platoons. An American private from the 29th Infantry Division, whose account was recorded in divisional records, described his experience near St. Lo in July of 1944. His name was recorded as Private Robert Collins, a 23-year-old from Pennsylvania who had worked in a steel mill before the war. The fighting around St. Lo was brutal. The Germans had converted every stone farmhouse, every church steeple, every pile of rubble into a defensive position, and among these positions, snipers waited. Collins's unit had been tasked with clearing a small village that sat astride a crucial crossroads. Artillery had already reduced most of the buildings to ruins, but that only made the snipers' job easier. They had countless hiding spots, unlimited fields of fire, and the patience to wait for the perfect shot. The unit's advance had stalled. Every time a soldier moved, a shot rang out. Sometimes it missed. Often it didn't. The company commander had already been wounded, shot in the shoulder when he raised his binoculars to scan the village. 2 medics had been hit trying to reach wounded men. The Germans knew that shooting medics would draw other soldiers out of cover, creating more targets. Collins and his squad were pinned behind a low stone wall about 300 yards from the village edge. They had been there for 4 hours, unable to advance, unable to retreat without exposing themselves to fire from multiple angles. That's when Sergeant Williams, a veteran who had fought in North Africa, remembered something he'd seen during the Tunisia campaign. "We need a dummy," Williams said, "something to draw their fire." The men looked at him skeptically. How were they supposed to build a convincing dummy with nothing but combat gear and rubble? Williams thought for a moment, then began issuing orders. "Collins, give me your field jacket. Thompson, I need your helmet. Harrison, see if you can find some branches, anything we can use for a frame." Working quickly, they constructed their decoy. The field jacket was stuffed with grass and dirt. They shaped it into a rough torso, supported by branches pushed into the ground. The helmet went on top. From their position, it looked amateurish at best. "This'll never work," Collins muttered. "It doesn't need to look real from here," Williams replied. "It needs to look real from there." He gestured toward the village where the sniper was hidden somewhere in the maze of destroyed buildings. They used a long stick to slowly raise the dummy, making it appear as if someone was cautiously rising to look toward the village. The key, Williams emphasized, was to make the movement look natural. Too fast, and it would obviously be a fake. Too slow, and it wouldn't seem like a legitimate target. The dummy rose, 1 foot, 2 feet. The helmet appeared above the wall. The shot came almost instantly. The helmet spun off, and the dummy collapsed. But Williams had been watching. Years of combat experience had taught him to track the source of gunfire, even when the shooter was well concealed. "Southwest corner," Williams said calmly. "Second floor of that building with the collapsed roof." I saw the muzzle flash. He radioed their position to a nearby M4 Sherman tank that had been supporting their advance. Within minutes, the tank had maneuvered to get a clear shot and put 3 high-explosive rounds into the building. The structure, already weakened, collapsed entirely. The sniper fire from that position ceased. Whether they had eliminated the shooter or simply forced him to relocate didn't matter. The psychological victory was just as important. The sniper was no longer invulnerable. He could be tricked. He could be beaten. The dummy trick spread through the ranks with remarkable speed. Soldiers shared their experiences, adapted the technique to different situations, and developed increasingly sophisticated variations. Some units began carrying pre-made dummies, crude mannequins that could be quickly deployed. Others learned to create more convincing decoys using spare uniforms filled with straw or grass, adding details like insignia or equipment to make them more realistic. The most elaborate versions included mechanisms that could make the dummies appear to move or even simulate breathing. In the Pacific Theater, American and Australian forces faced a different but equally deadly sniper threat. Japanese snipers, operating in the dense jungles of islands like Guadalcanal, New Guinea, and the Philippines, employed tactics that were as much psychological as tactical. Japanese snipers often tied themselves into trees, allowing them to maintain their positions even when wounded. They would wait for days in the same spot, barely moving, barely eating, waiting for the perfect shot. Their discipline was extraordinary, their patience nearly superhuman. American Marines quickly learned that advancing through jungle terrain without countering these snipers was nearly impossible. Traditional methods of suppressing snipers with heavy fire were less effective in the dense vegetation, where a sniper could be within 20 feet and remain completely invisible. Marine units began adapting the dummy technique to jungle warfare. One particularly effective variation involved using a helmet attached to a rifle, which could be extended above cover using the weapon as a pole. When the sniper fired, Marines would note the direction of the shot and then use flamethrowers or grenades to clear the suspected area. A Marine corporal named James Mitchell, who fought on Peleliu in September of 1944, described in a post-war interview how his unit developed an even more elaborate version of the trick. They created full-bodied dummies using spare uniforms and equipment. These dummies were positioned in exposed areas during night operations. In the morning, when Japanese snipers began their work, they would target these stationary figures. The Marines would observe from concealed positions, noting where the shots came from. Then, under cover of mortar fire and smoke, they would advance on the sniper positions. The technique was so effective that it became standard procedure in some Marine units. Intelligence officers even began analyzing which types of targets Japanese snipers preferred, allowing them to create more enticing decoys. Dummies dressed as officers or carrying radio equipment drew fire more quickly than those appearing to be regular infantrymen. But perhaps the most sophisticated use of dummy tactics came from the Soviet Union, where sniper warfare had evolved into something approaching an art form. The Soviets had taken sniper training more seriously than perhaps any other nation. Even before the war, the Soviet Union had established shooting clubs and marksmanship programs across the country. When Germany invaded in June of 1941, the Red Army had a ready pool of trained marksmen to draw from. Soviet sniper training emphasized not just marksmanship, but also deception, fieldcraft, and psychological operations. Students learned to create elaborate hides, to use decoys to draw enemy fire, and to work in pairs for maximum effectiveness. One of the most successful Soviet snipers, though not as famous as legends like Vasily Zaitsev or Lyudmila Pavlichenko, was a man who became known for his mastery of deception tactics. His methods, though recorded in Soviet military archives, remained largely unknown until after the Cold War. This sniper, operating during the defense of Stalingrad and later during the Soviet advance westward, developed a system that took the simple dummy trick to new levels of sophistication. He would create multiple decoys, positioning them at various points around his actual location. These decoys were crafted with meticulous attention to detail, each one slightly different to appear as individual soldiers. Then, from his concealed position, he would use strings and pulleys to move the decoys subtly, making them appear to shift position or peek around corners. German snipers, observing these movements through their scopes, would take shots at what they believed were clumsy Soviet soldiers. Each shot revealed the German sniper's position, and each time they revealed themselves, the Soviet marksman would note the location, calculate the angle, and plan his counterattack. According to records, this particular sniper was credited with eliminating 17 German snipers using variations of this technique. He would often wait days for the perfect opportunity, observing patterns in enemy sniper behavior, learning their preferred positions and habits. His most audacious operation occurred during the fighting around Kharkov in early 1943. German forces had established strong defensive positions on the outskirts of the city. Among these positions were several highly skilled snipers who had been inflicting serious casualties on advancing Soviet units. The Soviet sniper and his spotter spent 3 days observing the German lines, noting the locations where snipers were most active. They then spent an entire night constructing 5 elaborate dummies, each positioned in different locations across a 200-meter front. At dawn, they began their operation. Using carefully concealed strings, they made the dummies appear to move, creating the illusion of soldiers carelessly exposing themselves. The German snipers, who had dominated this sector for weeks, couldn't resist the apparently easy targets. Over the course of 6 hours, the Soviet sniper and his spotter methodically eliminated 4 German snipers. Each time a German fired at a dummy revealing his position, the Soviet marksman would wait, calculating the exact location, then take his shot when the German sniper inevitably shifted position or briefly exposed himself. The operation was so successful that it was later incorporated into Soviet sniper training manuals as an example of effective counter-sniper tactics. But the effectiveness of the dummy trick wasn't just about the mechanical aspects of deception, it was about psychology. It exploited fundamental aspects of human nature that even the most disciplined and well-trained sniper couldn't entirely overcome. Snipers operate in a state of heightened awareness, but also increasing fatigue. Hours of staring through a scope, maintaining absolute stillness, controlling breathing and heartbeat, takes a tremendous physical and psychological toll. When a target appears, particularly one that seems vulnerable or important, the temptation to take the shot can be overwhelming. The target presents itself, the crosshairs align, the finger tightens on the trigger. In that moment, training and caution can be overridden by instinct and the desire to complete the mission. Moreover, snipers face intense pressure to produce results. A sniper who goes days without a confirmed target faces questions from commanders, doubts from fellow soldiers. When an apparently easy shot presents itself, the pressure to take it to prove effectiveness can cloud judgment. The dummy trick also exploited the isolation of sniper warfare. Snipers typically operated alone or in pairs, separated from their units, often behind enemy lines. This isolation meant they lacked immediate confirmation or correction from others. If a dummy looked convincing through their scope, there was no one to provide a second opinion. German commanders eventually caught on to the widespread use of decoy tactics. Training programs were updated to warn snipers about dummies and to teach them identification techniques. Snipers were instructed to watch for unnatural movements, to observe targets for longer periods before shooting, to look for inconsistencies in appearance or behavior. Some German snipers developed their own counter-tactics. They would shoot at suspected dummies with the understanding that if it was a fake, they would need to relocate immediately. Others learned to identify dummies by watching for breathing movements, for slight adjustments in position, for any of the thousands of tiny movements that living soldiers make unconsciously. But even with these countermeasures, the dummy trick remained effective throughout the war. Why? Because at its core, it was exploiting something that couldn't be trained away: the fundamental nature of human perception and decision-making under stress. The success of these simple tricks also revealed a deeper truth about warfare. Technology and training certainly mattered. The German snipers had excellent weapons, superior optics, and rigorous training. But warfare ultimately comes down to human beings making decisions under pressure. And humans, no matter how well trained, can be deceived. On the Eastern Front, where the conflict reached levels of brutality that surpassed anything seen on other fronts, the dummy trick took on additional significance. The vast distances, the extreme weather, the shortage of resources all meant that simple, effective tactics could have disproportionate impact. Finnish forces, during their defense against the Soviet invasion in the Winter War of 1939-40, developed their own variation of the dummy technique. Finnish snipers, vastly outnumbered, but fighting on familiar terrain, used decoys to draw Soviet fire. They even gave their decoy system a name, Kylmäkala, or Cold Charlie. The Finns would use shop mannequins or carefully constructed dummies dressed in military uniforms. These would be positioned to look like soldiers, carelessly exposing themselves, often appearing to be officers based on the quality of the uniform or the addition of binoculars or maps. Soviet snipers, operating in the bitter cold and under pressure to produce results, would take shots at these decoys. Finnish anti-tank rifle teams would then use weapons like the Lahti L-39 to fire at the revealed Soviet positions. The massive 20-millimeter rounds from these weapons could penetrate the cover that protected snipers from normal rifle fire. The psychological impact of these tactics extended beyond the immediate tactical benefit. When word spread that decoys were being used, every sniper became more cautious. This caution, while prudent, reduced their effectiveness. They took longer to identify targets, passed up shots they might otherwise have taken, second-guessed their observations. The mere possibility of deception became a weapon in itself. As the war progressed and technology advanced, the dummy trick evolved as well. By 1944, some Allied units were using increasingly sophisticated decoys. These included dummies with internal mechanisms that created the appearance of breathing, dummy equipment that would emit heat signatures to fool German night vision equipment, and even dummy positions equipped with smoke generators and sound equipment to simulate activity. The Ghost Army, officially known as the 23rd Headquarters Special Troops, represented the apex of deception warfare. This top-secret American unit used inflatable tanks, fake radio transmissions, and elaborate ruses to fool German forces about the location and size of Allied armies. While the Ghost Army operated on a massive scale, the principles were the same as those employed by Private Ivan Dmitriev in that frozen farmstead in 1943. Make the enemy see what you want them to see. Exploit their expectations. Turn their training and discipline against them. The Ghost Army's operations saved thousands of lives by drawing German forces away from actual Allied positions. Their most successful operation, near the end of the war in March 1945, used 600 inflatable vehicles and elaborate staging to convince German forces that two entire divisions were preparing to cross the Rhine at one location, while the actual crossing occurred elsewhere with minimal casualties. But for the individual soldiers fighting at the squad and platoon level, the elaborate operations of the Ghost Army were irrelevant. They faced immediate personal threats from enemy snipers, and they survived in many cases because someone had the presence of mind to create a simple decoy from whatever materials were at hand. The records from various armies contain countless references to these improvised deception tactics. A British soldier's diary from the Italian campaign mentions using a helmet on a stick to draw fire from a sniper in a monastery bell tower. An Australian corporal's after-action report from New Guinea describes using a dummy to locate a Japanese sniper who had been terrorizing their position for 3 days. A Canadian sergeant's citation for bravery mentions using decoys to protect his men during the crossing of the Rhine. Each story was different in its details, but the fundamental technique remained constant. Create something that looks like a target. Present it in a way that appears natural. Wait for the enemy to reveal themselves. Then act. The simplicity of the trick was both its greatest strength and, paradoxically, why it continued to work throughout the war. It required no special equipment, no extensive training, no complex coordination. Any soldier with basic materials and a moment to think could employ it. And because it was so simple, so adaptable, it remained effective even after enemy forces became aware of it. After the war, military historians and tacticians studied these improvised deception techniques extensively. The dummy trick became incorporated into formal training programs for infantry and counter-sniper operations. Modern military forces still teach variations of it, adapted for contemporary warfare, but based on the same fundamental principles. In fact, during conflicts from Korea to Vietnam to more recent operations, soldiers have independently rediscovered and employed dummy tactics. Human nature hasn't changed. The psychology of sniping hasn't changed. And so the trick that seemed so ridiculous, so absurdly simple, continues to save lives. What makes these stories particularly remarkable is that they represent the creativity and adaptability of common soldiers. These weren't operations planned by generals or tactics developed by military strategists. They were solutions devised by scared, cold, hungry men who were trying to survive and protect their comrades. Private Ivan Dmitriev, whose story began this account, survived the war. He returned to his village, married, raised a family, and worked his farm until his death in 1987. He rarely spoke of his war experiences, as was common among Soviet veterans. But years later, his grandson found among his effects a small notebook where Ivan had recorded some of his wartime memories. In one entry, dated March 1943, Ivan wrote about the dummy incident, describing it in simple terms. He noted that the trick seemed foolish when Sergeant Volkov first proposed it, but that it worked. He wrote that they used similar techniques several more times during the advance westward, and that each time it revealed enemy positions that might otherwise have cost lives. The entry ended with a single line that perhaps best captures the essence of why such a simple trick could be so effective. The German sniper saw what he expected to see. That was his mistake. This truth, that people see what they expect to see, underlies not just the dummy trick, but much of military deception throughout history. From the Trojan Horse to Operation Fortitude, successful deception works because it aligns with the enemy's expectations and exploits their assumptions. For the ordinary soldiers of World War II, understanding this principle in an intellectual sense wasn't necessary. They understood it instinctively through experience and survival instinct. They learned what worked and what didn't through trial and error, with failure often meaning death. The dummy trick worked because it was fundamentally sound in its understanding of human psychology. It worked because it was simple enough to be employed rapidly with minimal resources. It worked because it was adaptable to different situations and could be modified on the fly. And it worked because, at the end of the day, snipers were human beings subject to the same perceptual limitations and psychological pressures as anyone else. As the war drew to a close in Europe in May of 1945 and in the Pacific in August of that year, millions of soldiers returned home carrying with them the lessons learned in combat. Among these lessons was a profound understanding of deception's power. The veterans who had employed dummy tactics, whether on the Eastern Front, in the bocage of Normandy, or in the jungles of the Pacific, knew that victory often came not from superior firepower, but from superior thinking. These experiences influenced post-war military doctrine in profound ways. The emphasis on deception and psychological operations became fundamental elements of Cold War strategy. The understanding that even the most sophisticated enemy could be fooled by simple, well-executed tricks informed everything from tactical infantry operations to strategic nuclear policy. But perhaps the most important legacy of these wartime experiences was more personal. The soldiers who survived learned something crucial about warfare and about life. That creativity, adaptability, and the willingness to try unorthodox solutions could mean the difference between life and death. The story of the dummy trick of Private Ivan Dmitriev and Sergeant Volkov, of Private Robert Collins and Sergeant Williams, of countless unnamed soldiers who independently discovered and employed similar techniques, is ultimately a story about human ingenuity in the face of mortal danger. It's a reminder that war, for all its technology and strategy, comes down to individual human beings making decisions under pressure. And sometimes the most effective solution is also the simplest one. The snipers of World War II were among the most highly trained, disciplined, and deadly soldiers on any battlefield. They represented the cutting edge of precision warfare, armed with the best weapons their nations could provide, trained to the highest standards, and motivated by duty, patriotism, and the desire to survive. And yet, time and again, they were fooled by a helmet on a stick, by a bag stuffed with grass, by a crude mannequin that wouldn't fool anyone from close range, but looked convincing enough through a telescopic sight from 200 meters away. There's something almost absurd about it. These elite warriors, these apex predators of the battlefield, defeated by what amounted to a scarecrow. But that absurdity, that apparent ridiculousness, was precisely why it worked. Because no one expects the simple solution. No one expects the obvious trick. The German sniper looking through his scope didn't think, that might be a dummy. He thought, that's a target. His training, his experience, his very excellence as a sniper made him vulnerable to deception because he was looking for threats, not tricks. In the chaos and confusion of combat, with lives on the line and split-second decisions required, even the most skilled warriors can be deceived. And the soldiers who figured this out, who recognized this fundamental truth about human nature and warfare, saved countless lives. The ridiculous trick wasn't ridiculous at all. It was brilliant in its simplicity, devastating in its effectiveness, and a testament to the ingenuity and courage of the common soldiers who employed it. As we look back across the decades at World War II, we tend to remember the great battles, the famous generals, the turning points that changed history. We remember D-Day, Stalingrad, Midway, and Berlin. These are the moments that defined the war, the events that determined its outcome. But the war was also won in countless small moments, in obscure locations, by ordinary soldiers whose names have been forgotten, but whose actions were no less crucial. It was won by men like Ivan Dmitriev, who stood behind a broken wall in a destroyed farmstead and helped execute a simple plan that saved lives. It was won by soldiers who refused to accept that the enemy's advantages were insurmountable, who looked at their situation and asked, how can we turn this around? It was won by creativity, adaptability, and courage. The dummy trick stands as a symbol of this aspect of warfare. It represents the power of human ingenuity to overcome seemingly superior force. It reminds us that in conflict, as in life, the most elaborate solution isn't always the best one. Sometimes the simplest approach, executed with thought and care, can achieve what complex strategies cannot. And it serves as a powerful lesson that remains relevant today. Whether in military operations, business, or personal challenges, the ability to think creatively, to see beyond the obvious, to understand and exploit human psychology can provide decisive advantages. The German snipers of World War II were formidable opponents. Their skill, training, and effectiveness made them some of the most feared soldiers on any front. But they were defeated time and again by something as simple as a dummy. Not because they were poor soldiers, but because they were human. And being human means being vulnerable to deception, to having our expectations exploited, to seeing what we expect to see rather than what's actually there. This is the story of how one private's ridiculous trick fooled German snipers. But it's really the story of thousands of soldiers on all sides of the conflict who discovered that sometimes the best weapon isn't a gun or a bomb or a tank. Sometimes the best weapon is simply understanding how the human mind works and using that understanding to survive another day. In the frozen ruins of a farmstead on the Eastern Front, in the rubble of a Norman village, in the dense jungle of a Pacific island, soldiers learned this lesson. And in learning it, they gained an advantage that no amount of firepower could provide. The war ended more than 75 years ago. The soldiers who fought it are mostly gone now, taking their stories with them. But the lessons they learned, the tactics they developed, the courage they showed in the face of overwhelming danger, these things remain. And among these lessons, perhaps none is more important than this. Never underestimate the power of a simple idea, executed at the right time, in the right place, by the right person. What seems ridiculous from one perspective can be brilliant from another. What seems obvious in hindsight was once a leap of creative thinking that saved lives. The next time you hear a proposal that sounds too simple, too obvious, too ridiculous to work, remember Private Ivan Dmitriev and his helmet on a stick. Remember the German sniper, highly trained and deadly, who saw what he expected to see and revealed his position as a result. Remember that in war, as in life, creativity and courage often matter more than resources or technology. And remember that sometimes the most effective solution is also the simplest one, if you have the wisdom to see it and the courage to employ it. This is the legacy of the dummy trick, not just as a military tactic, but as a lesson about human nature, about creativity under pressure, about the power of simple solutions to complex problems. It's a reminder that war is ultimately about people, and that understanding people, understanding how they think and what they expect, can be the most powerful weapon of all. As the sun sets on another day, decades removed from that frozen battlefield where Sergeant Volkov first proposed his ridiculous plan, we can look back and see the truth clearly. It wasn't ridiculous, it was ingenious. And it worked time and time again because it understood something fundamental about warfare and about humanity itself. The greatest victories often come not from overwhelming force, but from superior understanding. Not from expensive technology, but from simple ideas executed with skill and courage. Not from following the standard playbook, but from thinking differently, adapting, and being willing to try something that others might dismiss as too simple or too obvious. This is how one private's ridiculous trick fooled German snipers. And this is why that story, and thousands of others like it, deserve to be remembered and honored. Because they remind us that ordinary people facing extraordinary circumstances can achieve remarkable things through courage, creativity, and the willingness to think beyond the conventional wisdom. The war may be over, but the lessons endure. And among those lessons, this one stands out. Never underestimate the power of human ingenuity. Never assume that complex problems require complex solutions. And never ever dismiss an idea simply because it seems too simple to work. Because sometimes the simplest ideas are the ones that change everything.